Hello and welcome. In this video I'm going to do something slightly different from usual, as you might be able to tell by the size of the screen that I'm recording. Also the fact that where I normally use or normally do my demonstrations with something in the CentOS Red Hat Fedora family, today I'm covering the installation process for Debian 12. Now, right off the bat, you might notice something slightly different from what you'll see if you start the installation process with a piece of bootable media. I don't have a countdown prompting me that it's going to automatically do this install if I don't press anything, because I already pressed something so that I could have this set up to start my recording. Now, I am going to use the graphical install for my demonstration today. One of the really nice features about this install tool is it does actually have the capability for a text user interface, just in case your graphics drivers aren't quite cooperating with the install tool. I may make a separate video for that one, but we're hoping that the graphical install works. Now, initially, we're just going to pick a language and location for the actual install tool, and this will influence some of the decisions that it's going to help us make later on, such as the time zone and the keyboard that we're using. Now, the only language that I would consider myself fully fluent in is English, so I should probably click that. That option may be different for you. Pick the location. I'm not in the United States, I'm in Canada. The keyboard that I want, so this is one of those things that is influenced by what we already picked. It assumed, being in Canada, default keyboard layout that I would want is probably American English. Well, I do have a keyboard that is set up for Canadian French with easy shortcuts for all the accents. I don't use that one regularly, and again, I'm learning French. I'm not fluent in it, so I would be best to stick with a typical American English keyboard layout. Though again, that choice is up to you depending on what keyboard you have. This is a really good time to mention one of the distinct differences between this installer and the Anaconda installer that I'm normally used to. With the Anaconda installer that you find for CentOS Red Hat Fedora, there will be a little bit at the beginning of the install process where it detects your hardware and you have to wait a bit, but then you tick all of your options, set all of your configuration, tell it to begin installing, and the rest of the process is pretty much non-interactive. It does its own thing. Yes, it gives you some output showing you what's going on, but you don't really need to keep clicking things. With this install tool, you're involved the entire way along. You pick some options, you click next, it performs some of its tasks, it fills up a loading bar, and then it presents you with some more options to pick, and you fill those out and you click next, and a loading bar fills up, and then it presents you with some more options, and so on. I'm sure I have another video for the CentOS installation process, though I do believe that one is somewhat out of date. You'll have noticed in that one, or in many of my other videos, when we are doing something that is going to take some time, I will often pause the recording and come back when it's done, so you don't have to sit there and wait for my computer to do something. In this case, for this install process, I will end up having to do that several times. I will try to make a comment when I do. In case I miss it, it should generally be pretty self-evident when that is happening. But that little aside, it's now asking us to configure some information for the network, like the host name for this system. Since this is just for demonstration purposes, I am going to call this Demo Debian. the domain that this is going to be part of. For demonstration purposes, honestly, that doesn't really matter, but I'm going to use the demo domain that I typically use for all of my other demonstrations, demodomain.ca. Of course, in a workplace, you would have another administrator telling you what your domain name for your machines is supposed to be so that they can actually interact with the rest of your network. I had forgotten this. This is another distinct difference between this and the CentOS Red Hat Fedora family that I'm used to working with. With those, you can set up the root user account and set up an initial user as an administrator. With this install tool, you can use one or the other. If you do set a root password, the initial user that you create will not be an administrator. Of course, you could make them an administrator later on by using this root account. If you don't set up a root password, you effectively disable the root account, but your initial user that you create on the next couple of screens will be an administrative user. That is, they will have root-like powers. Because the use of the sudo command, which I either have or it's in my queue of videos that I'm going to be recording soon, I can't remember which, I think I already do have it, a video for or explaining the use of sudo and why it is generally a better plan than using root. We're not going to set up the root account. We're just going to skip this step and create an initial user who will have the ability to use that sudo command to perform any root-like task that they need. So I'm going to use my typical, creating users and passwords, I'm going to create my typical default fake administrator and admin, because of course, they're an admin. This first step is their full human-readable username. This might show up on, say, a graphical login screen. The next step is their login name. Again, this is a distinct difference from what I'm used to seeing, where on CentOS Red Hat Fedora, I might do firstname.last name. You're not allowed to use a period within login names on this particular distribution. You can use lowercase letters and numbers. So I'm just going to get rid of the period and be any admin. And admin still, just no period separating the first name from the last name. We do need to create a password for this user, keeping in mind that this user is going to have root-like capabilities, so we do want to make sure that this password is very secure. And as the text on the screen mentions, make sure it gets changed at regular intervals. I'm not going to go into the details of what makes a secure password. Security admins will cover that kind of thing, and the requirements and the suggestions change fairly frequently with regards to how long it should be, the combination of letters or numbers, two-factor authentication, things like that. We're not going to go into the details for that. We're just using a simple one-factor password. Setting up all those other things are something you could do after the machine is installed. We do need to tell this machine where it is. This is again one of the features that is determined by settings that I picked earlier. Because I told it I was in Canada, it's going to display for me the available time zones from Canada. I am in fact in Eastern Time, so I'll just click continue. It's going to detect the disks that I have. Now, like many other installation tools, we have the option to let this configure the drives that we have provided to it, but it is always a good idea to be able to customize this in case you need to. So we're going to click Manual, or I'm going to click Manual. I'm not going to pick guided partitioning because that would be effectively the same thing as the guided partitioning on the previous step. So I'm going to pick the drive that I allocated when I created this virtual machine. Since this is a brand new volume, it doesn't even have a partition table on it yet, the first thing it's going to ask is, do you want to write a file allocation table? Yes, I would like to, so that I can create other partitions on this drive. Now that I've done that, you'll notice the menu has changed a little bit. There's some more configuration options that I can pick, and most importantly, it does now show me this drive. So this menu and the next several menus are contextual. As you change something here, it will affect the things that you can pick on the next couple of menus. As you change things there, that will bring you back to this menu, and it might change things that you can set up here. For example, I did have it write the file allocation table, and then it brought me back here and changed what is displayed here, that I do now have this block of free space that I can start using. So I'm going to click that free space and click Continue, and I would like to create a new partition. I can allocate how large I want this partition to be. I'm going to make my first one 500 megs. We can pick whether that space will be allocated at the beginning of the currently available space or the end. Generally speaking, most of the time it makes sense to use the beginning, though I'm sure there are situations where the end also makes sense. But for my purposes, we're going to take up the space at the beginning for some things like an EFI system partition that is actually a default to being bootable, and I can say done. So now this machine will actually be able to be booted. Of course, it needs something that it can boot, so I'm going to create a new partition. Again, 500 megs at the beginning of the drive. ext4 is acceptable. I don't want that in root though. I want that as /boot, the actual files that will be used to start this operating system. The rest of the defaults are okay. Done setting up this partition. And we can keep allocating this space as we need. When you're a junior admin, typically someone more senior than you will have told you this is how we set up our machines. Potentially they might use the guided install and get a nice default setup, but in many cases you will want to customize that, and that's what we're doing here. But usually some seniorish admin will have told you, for that machine, we want this much swap space. We want this much space allocated to home. We're not using ext4, we're using XFS, or whatever other changes necessary as the case may be. So I'll pick a new partition. In this case, I'm going to be setting this one up for swap space. Now there's guides and guidelines for how much swap space you should use depending on the actual RAM space that you have. In this case, I'm just going to pick 4 gigs because for this virtual machine, that will be perfectly fine. Of course, I do need to tell it that it is a swap volume. It doesn't need to be bootable, so we can say done. You'll notice most of the other configuration options that I could have picked for this volume vanished. That's what I meant by contextual. As soon as I said, this is swap space, anything that would not apply to swap space is no longer selectable here. And then I'm going to take the rest of this and allocate this as, yes, the rest of that space. That is indeed what I want. Not in the ext4 volume. Where is it? Physical volume for logical volume management, or LVM. I have a whole nother video on what LVM is and how we can configure it. In order to do that, though, you do have to, well, generally you have to have started setting the machine up to use logical volume management when you install it. Admittedly, it is a bit of an extra step, a few extra things to configure, but it is well worth it in the long run. If you're not convinced, do feel free to go and watch the video on logical volume management. It will make it much easier to manage and maintain your system in the long run. So for now, that partition is done. But here's where this gets slightly confusing. I now need to go back up and now configure the logical volume manager. It's going to let me know that in order to do that, it does need to write several partitions onto the disk so that it can actually reach the logical volume management portion and actually write things when I need to for logical volume management to work. So yes, I would like it to write those changes to disk so that I can continue. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of physical volume versus volume group versus logical volume here. That is all covered in the logical volume management video that I have. We have one physical volume. We will turn that into a volume group. By convention, that typically starts with VG, and I'm going to call that demo because this is my demonstration machine. And that's going to use the physical volume that we just assigned for logical volume management. I would have expected that that would be selected by default, but I guess it's just letting you confirm this is the one that goes in that. Of course, you might have multiple volumes that were selected for that. That is one of the advantages of LVM, but I'm getting into that video that I said. Go watch that video, so I'm just going to move on. Now that I have a volume group, you'll notice again a contextual menu has changed. I can now start creating logical volumes, and this will look similar to the process of creating the volumes that we had before, although we will need to give them names. By convention, they typically start with LV, so I might have LV root and write something for most of the operating system. I will create another logical volume using the volume group that I created, and I'm going to call that one LV home. You can sort of guess where that's going to be used. Maybe I'll use 40 gigs for that, even though that is way more than I need for this demonstration machine. And I'll create one more logical volume using that volume group that we have. I'll call that LV images because I'm going to use that for logical or virtual machine images. And for that, I'll just use the rest of the available space. When I'm satisfied with that, I could display the configuration details. It will let me know roughly what it's going to do. And when I'm happy, if I needed to change anything, I could change things. If I needed to extend the volume group, if I had another drive that I had forgotten to include in logical volume management, I could do that now, though that is a task better represented by that separate logical volume management video that I already have recorded. So I'm just going to click Finish. And now I'm back in that previous contextual menu that I mentioned, and I now have these other volumes that I can now format as needed. So I have the one for LV home, which I will then say, I do actually want that in use. I'm going to pick ext4, and I'm going to mount that to /home. Defaults are generally fine, so I can say I'm done setting that up. I'm going to take the LV root. I am going to use that. It's going to be ext4. You'll notice there are a number of other file system types in there. I'm not going to get into the details and the advantages and disadvantages and features of those various file system types. Again, typically you would have a senior administrator who is going to tell you this is the file system type you should use for that. By the time there is not somebody telling you that, you will have had time to learn the features and be able to make that decision on your own. This was LV root, I think, so I'm going to pick the root of the file system. And actually I can double check that with the text up at the top of the screen there. Yes, it was in fact LV root. Oh, this is one of the things that I mentioned was slightly confusing. I keep getting this wrong. Because this was highlighted when I clicked continue, it takes me back into that menu so I can rechange or alter whatever option that I picked. If I want to continue, I do need to make sure I have picked the option done setting up the partition. To go back to that previous menu that we've already seen, where I can finally take my images volume there, continue. Yes, I would like to use it. It's going to be ext4, and I'm going to mount that. In this case, there's not a common option pre-selected or available predetermined for me, so I can enter that manually. Because this is going to be used for virtual machine images, we're going to set this fairly large volume, well, large compared to everything else on this machine that I'm setting up, to the directory, to the mount point that I would expect to use for virtual machine images, which is /var/lib/libvirt/images. Done setting up this partition, and now I can scroll way down to the bottom, finish partitioning, write changes to disk. And we'll start, well, first, it will display, here's what we're going to set up for you, with a warning that if you click continue past this screen, it is going to overwrite anything that was on that disk before this point. In this case, I know that that is a virtual machine image file already, so I'm not too worried about that. But if you are actually configuring a machine and these are physical drives that are attached to it, you may want to double check and make sure that this is not actually already in use by another system, and that there, if it was at any point, that there is not anything important left on it. When you're sure that it's safe, you click yes and continue. And here's one of those menus where it might take a few minutes, so I'm going to pause the recording. And several minutes later, I'm back, waiting through that loading bar, which is actually a good time to mention. I realized just after I hit pause that I said menu, not loading bar. That was a loading bar. That was going to take some time. My apologies. But here we are. That loading bar has filled up. It's done a portion of the system installation. The base install is there. And it's taking a look at the installation media that I'm using, which is a net install ISO file. Generally speaking, I actually prefer the full install ISO because then I don't need to download further packages across the network, which, depending on the quality of your network or how remote you are, can take some time. However, this particular distribution release, they suggest using the net installer, so here we are. Do I want to scan other media? So if I had the complete install ISO ready to be read, I could probably point at that, but I don't, so I'm going to click no. the package manager that I'm going to use, that is the tool that we will use for installing, removing, managing our software. What language do we want that to work in? What country do we want that to work in? Again, I'm in Canada because that was the option that I picked earlier. That's what it pre-selects, though there is a nice warning there. If you're on the border or close to the border from one country to another, it is entirely possible that there might be an image repository in a major city just across the border, which might actually get you faster access than something on the other side of your own country. Now, for example, one of the mirrors that are available there is from UBC, that is British Columbia. Not quite the exact opposite end of Canada, but pretty far from where I happen to be. I happen to know that the CS Club at U Waterloo is usually pretty reliable, and they're not that far away from where I happen to be. So that's probably a solid choice. If I wasn't aware of that, of course, the default Debian.org would also be safe. I'm not using a proxy, so we're just going to leave this as blank. And now we wait through another loading bar. I'm going to pause the video, and we'll be back soon. And several loading bars later, the system has now connected to an online repository and downloaded some software. It's asking if I want to allow it to monitor the packages that I use so it can provide information to package suppliers so they can make better choices about managing those packages. Because this is a demo machine and I'm not actually going to be doing anything after today. In fact, as soon as this video is done, it's going to get deleted. I am going to say no. And we're still in a loading bar. Oh, there we are. We're actually partway through that loading bar, but we do have the option to pick software that we do want installed. By default, it's going to try to give me a desktop environment, some common utilities, probably an SSH server so I can talk to it remotely. Back to the loading bar, and I'm going to pause and we'll be back shortly. Okay, and sometime later, I won't say how much, I'll leave that for you to explore for yourselves, that installation of software is complete. The machine is ready to reboot. It is asking you to remove the installation media. If this was a physical machine, you would do that now, and then click reboot. Because this is a virtual machine, I'm just going to click continue, and then that will make the machine reboot. And at a later date, whenever is convenient, sooner rather than later, you can go into the virtual machine management software and disconnect the ISO from your virtual machine. And of course, there's one more loading bar. It reboots into Debian GNU Linux. Of course, the portion of the screen that I was recording was fixed to the size of the virtual machine that I had before, so it's going to run into a problem here. You can see the full name of the user that I created. This is the handy thing about creating a full name. I am going to click on them. If I need to move the screen around a little bit, there are scroll bars so I can focus on the stuff that needs to get focused on. I'm not going to try to resize the recording area in the middle of a recording. I get the feeling it would not work well. So we click on that user, log in as them, and it will go through a first boot process, just setting up the environment for this particular user. So let me focus the screen on the part that's actually important right now. So what is the preferred language for this user? I think I only installed English. Oh, I could probably search for a different one. But yeah, English Canada, that works. English US, what? I just had you on English Canada. Didn't I? Okay, just don't break the system like I did. And there's a continue button around here somewhere. There it is. Location services, I'm going to turn off. Next. Online accounts, not connecting to, so I'm just going to skip. All done. Start using this distribution of Linux. And you have now successfully installed GNU Debian Linux. This is, of course, I didn't go into the full details of absolutely everything you could configure. One of the things that it did set up for us automatically was a DHCP network address. If we used the advanced mode for the install, it would not have done that for us. We could set that up ourselves. Of course, we can also set that up ourselves through the graphical menu here, which maybe I'll stick in another video under wired settings, or through the command line, which is generally the preferred way. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video.